Hi, welcome to this episode of How to Go Independent. Hope 2016 is treating you well so far if you're listening to this in 2016. If you're listening sometime after that, then welcome back. Today you're going to hear a little bit of a solo show with me talking about the answer to the question, what is the minimum amount of production I need to go independent? So this will address kind of that low end of the market where someone is just trying to get themselves out of a job maybe they don't enjoy, or they don't feel like they have control of their destiny, or they don't own the relationships. For whatever reason, they decide they would like to have their own practice. And I think in a lot of cases, the minimum production standards at the employee firms mislead us into thinking we need a much bigger revenue stream than is really necessary to at least make it viable. So in later episodes, we'll talk about the high end of the market, the complete opposite of the spectrum with billion-dollar teams. But I think it's important to understand that there are ways to make a pretty low production number, low revenue number, a viable job. Again, it might be a lot better than working for someone else, and it could be a start. So with that, I will get into it. And if you have any thoughts or questions or concerns or things you think are inaccurate or need to be expounded upon, please email me at sean@indyfa.com. That's INDYFA.com. And on with the show. Some people ask me, what's the minimum amount of production I need to do to set up an independent business? I think that's a great question because there's a lot of misinformation about what that number really is. Certainly to set up a practice that looks like a wirehouse setup, you'll need a pretty good amount of production, but that's a big qualifier. So if you just want to be able to make a living and willing to do a lot on your own, I think you'll find that number's a lot lower, and I'll walk us through the numbers here shortly. First, let's talk about the two main types of independence that you want to think about, and I think one of them fits a lot better at the lower end of the production scale. So the two main ways you can go independent would be to set up your own RIA, or Registered Investment Advisor firm, or you can affiliate with an independent broker-dealer firm, which would have its own corporate RIA, much like the employee firms do. When you're an employee at a big firm, you don't really probably notice the distinction too much. But so an RIA of your own would involve setting up a legal entity that registers with, in this case, with the state, because we're talking smaller. If you have $100 million under management of advisory assets, then you would set up an SEC registered advisory firm, RIA. But to answer this question, I think we can assume that setting up an RIA probably, for most of us, is going to be more costly than it needs to be. Now, it can certainly be done, and there's some articles I can link to that are, for under $10,000, you can set one up. But I think that's more if you're going to have a fee-for-service model. So I'm going to assume for now we're talking about someone that's an employee at a firm that's used to sort of that model, not starting from scratch, doing financial planning for a flat fee. So I would lean probably away from the RIA model in this case. So to affiliate with an independent broker-dealer, the good news is it can be done, and I'm going to use the example of $100,000 of gross revenue. And the reason I'm going to use that is because it's enough to probably make a better living than you make at an employee firm, even with a slightly higher production than that. So it'll count for a little bit of not 100% retention. And I think in general, unless you're fairly new in the business, if you can't bring that much over, then it may or may not be worth your while. You can adjust the numbers that I'll propose for lower production amounts and kind of see what that nets. But I think that's you're getting to the point where you might be better off just finding someone to work for, and bring some clients. But so here's here's kind of what I would look for first of all. One, you want to find a firm, broker, dealer that supports the lower end of the production scale. So if you find someone who has a $100,000 minimum and you think you can do 120, I would recommend looking elsewhere, because otherwise you're going to run into the same problem that people have run into at employee firms, where at a Merrill Lynch, if you don't do 300, or most wirehouses, if you don't do 300 or 250 at Edward Jones or whatever the number is, you're going to be always worried about a number. And being independent is great, but I think one of the main benefits should be that you don't have to worry about someone else's number for your business. You worry about that, not someone else. So I think if there's Commonwealth is a great independent firm. They tend to attract and look for $500,000 producers and up, let's say. So you probably, if you're doing 510, you probably would want to at least take that into consideration and ask them a lot of questions. I don't have any direct knowledge at the moment, but make sure that they're not going to ask you to find another home if you do 490 one year. That's a big consideration for any of us, but particularly if you're at the lower end of the spectrum and you don't have as much flexibility and don't get as much love as the $500,000 producer. So I guess that's my first thought is, if you're going to look around, look for a firm that is willing and able to support, in this example, a $100,000 per business. And that's even if you plan to grow, because I think you want to make sure you have enough runway and time and flexibility to do it on your terms and not someone else's. So look for a firm that's happy to have you as a customer / advisor, broker, rep, agent, and then start to look at their numbers. So I'll use numbers from the firm I'm affiliated with, because I know them fairly well. Given the world we live in, I would assume you could find other options that would be similar, because it's a competitive world. And the firm I'm affiliated with, I think, is still willing and able to support this kind of business. So we'll go from there. So if you're affiliated directly with my firm and use their home office supervision, you will have a 90% payout on mutual funds, advisory business, annuities, most things that are not stocks or bond transactions. So if you don't have any stock and bond transactions, or very little, you can probably assume you're going to be pretty close to 90% as a gross payout. If you do a lot of stocks and bonds, that might be a little lower. But let's just use 85%, sort of for an average. I think that's a pretty reasonable estimate. So 85% top line before expenses. So the main expenses you'll incur would be, for the home office supervision, it's about $5,000 a year. So that's how you get the relatively high payout, is you're using their home office support, so you're paying them $5,000 a year for that privilege. Then the other big batch of costs will be the state licensing fees, the firm affiliation fees, sort of the hard dollars that you pay them out of your commissions and fees to be affiliated, for their technology, for the E&O is a large one. That's about almost $3,000 to $4,000 a year. So there's a bunch of costs of doing business that aren't really optional, and those tend to run around $10,000 a year is a good estimate. And that's rounded up a bit, but that's a good number. Includes a few bucks for your firm element CE. And remember, if you're not used to being independent, you're going to pay a la carte for various things that you don't write checks for now. So your state licenses, you're going to pay for those. So you're going to be careful to only pay for states that you do business in, and hopefully you do enough business to offset the cost of the license, or you may decide that the client or the clients are not a good fit if it costs you money to do business with them. Then the only other, I have a category for miscellaneous, so that's miscellaneous business expenses that don't add up probably to a lot. Probably need to have a phone. You have minimal, depending on how you operate, you have some office supply type expenses. You'll have some other expenses. I just put down $5,000 a year. For some people that may be too high. For others, again, if you're going to do marketing, that could You could spend as much as you want on marketing, or as little. So those are the main categories: $5,000 a year for home office supervision, $10,000 a year for what I call the cost of doing business, and then another $5,000 for what we'll call miscellaneous. Then the two biggest costs for many practices, including mine, and most of the bigger, larger business in our industry, are going to be your staff and your office. So at the $100,000 production level, I would probably try to, unless you have a really solid and direct plan of growth, I would try to start with a no home office and no staff, because again, if you spend money on those two categories, you're going to eat into your profits. Now you might be able to find a fairly inexpensive office that could help with perception if you're trying to grow, at least especially when you're moving over. I've subleased from another LPO advisor in a nice building, not a huge office, but it's 130 square feet, big enough for one person for sure. I've done that for $500 to $600 a month for 6 years. It's 2015 as I record this, but that's in a big metro area, not on the coast, but it can be done, and that could be something you might want to invest in for perception if you think it would help. And then if you grow, that's easy to overcome that expense. Or if you get settled and realize you just want to maintain your existing clients and take referrals, then you can always drop that later. And I think I could drop my office now, and my clients it wouldn't matter. So I'm going to assume zero for both of those expenses, for staff and for office. So to recap, if we're assuming $100,000 of gross revenue, an 85% payout on average, so that's $85,000 of revenue before expenses. We're assuming $5,000 for home office, $10,000 for the kind of the cost of doing business, licensing, and then $5,000 for miscellaneous. So that's just $20,000 of expenses. So that would net you $65,000 a year. So as I looked at these numbers several years ago when I learned about the independent model, I usually did a slightly higher revenue because I was an employee and I had to do 180 or whatever the number was. So I figured if I was going to do 180, I might as well do it for myself. That was one of my first thoughts, because then I did these numbers and they were pretty nice compared to the 40% or so I would have netted at that firm when I got to 180, which coincidentally is I left when I had my trailing 12 was 189,000. So that's noteworthy or coincidental, or maybe not. But anyways, the point is making $65,000 a year, working for yourself. You kind of own your time. That's not a bad gig compared to where you may be now if you're asking the question, what's the minimum? So that's great news. I think it's a phenomenal option to consider. You have to be willing and able to do all the paperwork yourself, and you're going to have to keep yourself accountable, or you're going to see a lot of probably pushback and headaches from your firm. You want to make sure your compliance paperwork's in order and all that. That's very doable, especially if you don't have hundreds and hundreds of clients that make up that $100,000 revenue. If you have 100 clients or 200 clients that make up that book, and they're relatively easy to deal with and you enjoy them, I think there's a lot worse ways to make $65,000 a year. I think that's not a bad deal. So one major thought to add to this, though. I think if you're asking yourself that question, probably the biggest question is, well, how confident are you that you're going to retain $100,000 of revenue, or whatever you think you'll retain? Because keep in mind that the revenue I'm talking about on the top line, it's a lot like mutual fund performance. You don't get the past performance. You only get what you bring over. So that's your future performance. So if you're a mutual fund, that's to further that analogy, if you're at a bank and you're doing $400,000, but every client of yours has been brought to you by the bank, you probably want to assume a worst case scenario, unless you've been there so long that everybody is with you and not the bank. But that's, I use banks as an example because that's typically where we see lower retention rates. Because typically they start as bank customers and may not become your clients over time. But so my point is, if you're in a situation that's more captive, or like I mentioned, a bank where you didn't develop the business, that's I see a huge correlation with who developed the business and the retention rate when someone goes independent. I just find that to be a huge determinant. So make sure you've built in a buffer, because otherwise you're going to come over, go independent, and then be looking for another job, and that's no fun. Now I will say one kind of positive note there is if you overestimate what comes over. The good thing is if you bring over $50,000 in revenue, and that doesn't work very well unless you're comfortable making, maybe you have a spouse that makes good income, or maybe you're fairly young and have very low expenses, and if you run those numbers at 50,000 in revenue, you're going to be somewhere around. It's not going to work out very well. 85% of 50 is 42.5 minus 20,000 expenses, so you're down in the $20,000 to $25,000 income range. Which again, if you just want to treat this like a part-time job, maybe that works. But let's say it doesn't, and you need to make $65,000 a year is what you need to make. Well, you have an asset then at $50,000 of revenue that you could sell that block of business to someone else, and they'd be happy to pay you somewhere between probably $50,000 and $100,000. So at a minimum, I've told people this before, these corporate jobs to go work at Fidelity or Schwab or Ameritrade or a bank and be a bank broker or wherever it is to make, that's a pretty safe way to make $65,000. You can always go do that later, and you'll have basically a year's worth of salary up front if you have a $50,000 block of business, for example. So the point is, if you can move anybody, you'll have something that's valuable. You'll have to have that conversation with clients and make sure it's a smooth handoff so that they feel taken care of, because it's not just a widget you're selling. You're selling a relationship, so you have to make sure that's done well. But so the point being, you have an asset that you can then move on with, and I've seen people do that had a relatively small practice, and a better deal came up. In one case, a guy I know went to work for USAA, and phenomenal benefits. He had young kids, tried to build out a practice and add people in an office, didn't work out like he'd hoped, and he about 5 years ago went to work for USAA and is enjoying a great career there. So that's worked out well. He got money for his practice, and lives happily ever after, hopefully, and the other party, the buyer, did too, hopefully. So hopefully that answers the question of what's the minimum production to go independent. The more the better, but it can certainly be done at a fairly modest level. So let me know if you have any questions. And there you have it. Hope you enjoyed that, especially if you're in that scenario where you're trying to decide if you should stay in the business or what you're going to do. I think hopefully if you're on that fence, this will help you think of an option that maybe you didn't realize was available. If you or someone well has kind of made the jump to independence with a fairly modest production level, revenue level, and grown into a more substantial business, please let me know. I'd love to hear your story, maybe tell it in a future episode. That's all for now, and please leave us a review on iTunes if you haven't had a chance to do that. If you're not sure how to do that, let me know. Sean@indiefa.com, and I can help show you how. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.